what?
Oh.
Yeah.
You just want a bandwagon.
90.
Whoever was winning.
I like the Lakers. And I'm also a Jimmy Johnson fan. That's how it's been moving.
Good. How you doing, man?
Good?
Nice to see you. Yeah, you too. How have you been? No. This one, you already like it? So, we'll talk.
Morning.
All I hope is this.
I just hope you like definition. It was like multiple quick.
Start watching the video. Fast pace.
There you go.
And then you see, if you watch the classic, you see my dude, I got hair there, but it's my yarmulke. They said it sounds good. They did a lot of work. Fees to help them. Give them 75%, 25%, monthly. 75%. So they said that.
Just texting you.
Oh, did you?
You want this chair here?
Yeah. Actually, I might be blocking.
Yep. No, I'll move over if you want.
Okay, I've got this league at 8 o'clock, so let's get started. Today, the plan is to get through an absolute minimum of the first two handouts. We've obviously gotten through the majority of handout 1. We're going to kind of finish that up and then move on into handout 2. And then, if at all possible, we're going to try to get into chapter 11 and cover that material if at all possible. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off. The last two concepts that sort of cover both handout 1 and handout 2 are net present value and internal rate of return. So what we're going to do is kind of work through a couple of different types of problems as it relates to these concepts, try to explain kind of what you do and how you do what you do and what it all means. So let's start out, and let's assume that we have the following set of cash flows. We've got a property that we have purchased for $1 million, and our cash inflows each year, let's say, are going to be 250, 300, 200, 275, and 295. Okay? So let's start with that, and let's make the assumption that in this particular case, the value of the property is going to stay relatively constant, so we're going to sell the property pretty much for what we paid for it. So around $1 million. Okay, so the first question that we want to ask, and what we did I think last week, was to calculate just simply the internal rate of return. What is the rate of return that we're getting off of this series of cash flows? All right, so in order to do that with the calculator, assuming all of these are annual cash flows, assuming all of them are occurring at the end of the year, you're first going to set it up as follows. So one payment per year. So you're going to take the $1 million. That's going to be a cash outflow at time period 0. And then the subsequent cash flows of the 250, 300, 200, 275, and then for the final cash flow, you're going to add together obviously all of the revenue received in that final year. So the operating cash flow of the 295 plus the 1 million. Okay? So that final cash flow is going to be 1,295,000. Okay? So none of that is new. We did that last week. All right. So after we've done that, then to solve for the internal rate of return, so we're going to hit the shift key and solve for internal rate of return. So let's do that real quick. So we get 26.16 rounded. Okay? Everybody good with that? Now, what does that number mean? Simply that on average, we're getting roughly an annualized return each of those 5 years of around 26%. Okay? Everybody cool with that? Now, one of the next questions that we might want to ask is what is the net present value, okay? And what do we have to, or what other piece of information do we need to use in order to calculate a net present value? We need to know the what?
What your desired rate is.
What your hurdle rate is, okay? Now, in this case, let's just say that our hurdle rate is 10%. So we would put in 10% as our actual interest rate. I'm going to explain this here in just a second, what the hurdle rate is and how that works. Then you're going to solve for NPV. Once again, and the NPV is right next to the IRR down there on that I think second or third row. Underneath, the NPV is underneath the PRC key. Okay? Now when we do this, we end up with an NPV of $617,391.39. Okay. Now, first of all, let's explain what a hurdle rate is, okay? virtually all investors set some sort of an internal kind of hurdle rate for themselves whenever they go to invest in projects. And usually that hurdle rate is determined by what maybe their cost of capital might be in terms of borrowing costs they might have, what kind of rate of return that they may desire on the money that they personally have and they want to invest. And so they set some sort of a benchmark of saying, we want at least, in this case, a 10% rate of return for any project that we choose to invest in. And as long as we get that 10%, we're going to be happy, okay? And so that anything above and beyond that 10% is it's just extra icing on the cake, okay? Now, if it goes below 10%, that means that's a project that we're not going to be interested in, we're not going to pursue, because it doesn't meet our base sort of rate of return. Okay, is everybody cool with that? Now, in this particular project, we already know before doing the calculation for the NPV that we meet that hurdle rate, because the actual rate of return for the project is 26%. Okay, so it's clear we have met the hurdle rate of the 10%. Is everybody cool with that? But why do we need to do this calculation? Okay, so what this calculation here does is this inserts our hurdle rate, our required rate of return, and then the answer that we get here of this net present value is this is basically saying that is our profit above and beyond that 10%. Or another way of looking at it is we could have spent an extra $617,000 up front and still met our hurdle rate. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just play around with this just for a second. Let's say that our hurdle rate instead were 15%. So all you're going to do is just put in the 15% right after that. I'm going to put in everything else and then just resolve for net present value. Let's see what we get. So 376, 813, 67. So by having that higher hurdle rate, that higher benchmark, what we're saying is, in this case, if this were our hurdle rate instead of the 10%, then we're getting our 15% rate of return, but we're only getting about $376,000 worth of profit, meaning with that hurdle rate, we could have paid an additional $376,000 up front and met basically that 15% hurdle rate. Everybody still with me? Okay, let's change it again. Just going to keep going up a little bit. So let's say that we go to right below what our actual return is. Let's go to 25%. $31,385.60. So same logic. Now we have set our hurdle rate at 25%. So under that circumstance, we're still making a profit because that is, the hurdle rate is still below what the overall return of the project is. But in this case, it is obviously substantially lowered the amount of profit that we would have made above and beyond that hurdle rate. Does that make sense? So now we're only at about $31,000, meaning, once again, we could have paid an additional $31,000 up front and still met our hurdle rate. So let's just put in 27%, so slightly above the actual return on the project. So now we should end up with a negative net present value. In this case, the negative $21,832.32. So once again, what we're saying here is, okay, we haven't met our hurdle rate. If our hurdle rate is 27%, the project has only yielded 26%, therefore we lost, if you will, $21,000 sense that that is the amount that we are deficient on in order to meet that hurdle rate of 27%. Does that make sense? Or another way to put it is, we would have had to have paid $21,832 less for the project up front in order to meet that hurdle rate. Okay, everybody with me? Okay, very, very useful sort of tool. Now, it doesn't take a big step of logic to understand what's probably going to happen now. If we put in 26.16%, we should get fairly close to zero. We're not going to get precisely zero because of rounding, okay? But we should get fairly close to zero. So let's just see what we get. 26.16, that is our interest rate, solve for net present value. So yeah, $5.66, okay? Now, if we would have carried out, obviously, the decimal places on what that actual return of the 26.16 is, and carried it out, then obviously we would have gotten precisely zero, okay? Any questions about that? Conceptually, does it make sense?
Yes.
Is there anything about it that throws you for a loop? Okay? So let's approach it a little bit differently. All right, so let's say that we've got a situation of where we don't know what we should pay for the property, okay? But what we do know is that it's going to generate the following annual cash flows of 100,000, let's say 150,000, 175,000, 200,000, and 225,000, okay? And at the end of all of this, we're going to expect that the property is going to sell for, I don't know, let's do this a little bit different. So, we talked, I believe, a little bit about the cap rate, but let's talk about it a little bit more, where the formula for the cap rate is the net operating income for the property divided by the cap rate gives us value, okay? So in this particular case, let's say that this is our net operating income of $225,000, and that for this particular product type, whatever it is, that we have a cap rate of, let's say, 8%. Okay, so to establish what the value would be for that particular property, we're going to say maybe it's 2.8 million. All right. So let's just say that's the dollar amount we're going to use here. Now, technically, we really should probably be using year 6 NOI, but we're going to get into that later, so don't worry about that right now. Okay. So right now, we're just trying to establish a rough value for what the property potentially would sell for at the end of this 5th year, using the cash flow from that 5th year. All right. Now, the question that I might pose to you would be, how much should we pay for the property up front? Okay? Any other information that you might need to know? Ken?
Hurdle rate.
Okay, you need to know your hurdle rate. Okay? So, in this case, let's say that we use a hurdle rate of, once again, 10%. All right? So, assuming a hurdle rate,
So then, what's your 8% then? Or your
that is a cap rate.
Oh.
The cap rate is simply the rate of return the project needs to generate in order to attract capital to it. Okay? Not necessarily your capital, but the market's capital. Usually your hurdle rate is going to be higher than whatever the cap rate is.
You have to pay your investors.
Right. Okay, so our hurdle rate in this case, let's say, is going to be 10%. All right, so now in terms of setting this up, it's really not going to be that complex and nor that different, but just want to make sure that you understand how to do it. You've got one payment per year. Okay. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to put in 0 as your initial cash flow. So in other words, all we're doing is we're saying, okay, this first one, we don't know it, we're gonna put it in as 0, all right? And then, you're gonna put in the 100,000, 150, oops, 175, 200, and then for the final cash flow, we're gonna add those two together. So I get 3,037,500. Okay. Now what we're going to do, we're not going to be able to solve for internal rate of return because there was no investment. Okay. If you try to solve for internal rate of return, you're probably not going to get an answer. Okay. You may get no solution or something like that, or some ridiculous, answer. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to put in our hurdle rate of the 10%, and then we're going to solve for NPV. And that is going to tell us how much we can afford to pay up here at time period 0 for this property in order to achieve that rate of return. Okay. So what I get is $2,369,007, and if you want to keep going, 33 cents. Okay, so you guys got it? Okay, so all that's telling us is that if this scenario is posed to us of this series of cash flows for an investment we want to make, that's what it ultimately will sell for, and we are simply trying to determine how much we should pay for this investment today, assuming if we want to have a 10% hurdle rate, then this is the amount we should pay. Okay, everybody cool with that? Now, if for whatever reason, let's just without putting it in the calculator, just for a moment, just to see if you're actually, sort of grasping this. Let's say that we did put in a 15% hurdle rate. What is that going to do to this number? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Or is it going to stay the same?
Down.
It's going to go down, meaning that we should pay less, because if our hurdle rate is higher or our required rate of return is higher, then that means for that same series of cash inflows, we have to pay less up front in order to achieve that same hurdle rate. Okay, so let's just put in 15% and see what happens. See how much it goes down. Okay. Okay. Now, this brings up, so once again, you can sort of see the difference, about 400 grand, obviously, sort of, because our hurdle rate or our cost of capital, whatever word we want to use, is higher. That means we can't pay as much for the property. Okay, now, this is an exceedingly valuable lesson from the standpoint of, you always hear about when interest rates are low, real estate values are high, okay? Or vice versa. Whenever, interest rates go up, real estate prices tend to go down. Okay, same sort of logic here, in that if you've got a situation of where your cost of capital as an investor is going up for whatever reason, you're demanding a higher rate of return, you're having to borrow at a higher rate of interest, whatever the reason is, that means that you're not going to be able to pay as much for the property as you would if you had a low cost of capital. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, it's a very fundamental sort of issue and concept. So this also helps to explain why institutional players, that have huge, massive sums of cash that cost them very little in the sense of the rate of return that they have to pay out to their investors, that they have a super low cost of capital. So almost in every single instance, institutional investors are going to be able to outbid the average ordinary person simply because they have such a low cost of capital. Does that make sense? Okay? And so that's, once again, another just sort of fundamental thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind, as you're sort of looking at this kind of information. Okay, so any questions off of this? Yep.
What was you said something about why we couldn't get the internal rate of return? What was that again?
Okay. If you don't invest any money,
Oh,
in other words, it's a zero. If you don't invest any money and you try to calculate a return off of a $0 investment, any sort of money that you get, to a certain extent, it's like an infinite rate of return. Because you're basically saying, all right, I'm just giving you money. But you're not, you haven't invested anything. Okay? So in that case, with a $0 investment, any sort of return calculation would be meaningless. Okay? All right, anybody else? Yep.
Quick question, just the one thing I guess I never was able to connect the dots on, when you go in and set up your hurdle rate, like I know, so I'm taking into consideration how much my debt's gonna cost and so forth like that, and then probably taking into consideration what I'm promising my investors.
Correct.
So, can you kind of walk me through that process, just so because I'm
Okay,
not.
we're going to get to it a little bit later,
Okay.
but I'll go a quick and dirty version, okay? Basically your weighted average cost of capital, or your hurdle rate, is going to be equal to, basically over here, your cost of debt, and then your return on equity. And so what you start out with is, what is your capital structure? In other words, how much money are you borrowing versus how much money are you investing? Well, on the debt side, let's say that we've got an 80% loan-to-value ratio, okay? So if you're borrowing 80%, all right, and you're borrowing that at, let's say, I don't know, 5%, okay, is your interest rate. All right? Then on the other side of the equation, if you're borrowing 80% to go into a project, then that means that you've got to come up with 20% equity. In other words, 100% minus 80% equals 20% equity. So that is basically your down payment percent, okay? And then what's left over is, in essence, your hurdle rate, or not your hurdle rate, your return on equity. Okay? Now your return on equity is what you were just sort of saying. This is the amount that you're basically promising your investors, okay, your equity investors. Now, once again, this is getting a lot more complicated, which we're going to get into later in the semester whenever we start sort of slicing and dicing those returns. But in this case, we have one investor, okay? How much of a rate of return does that one investor want on every dollar that they invest in this project? So let's just say they want, I don't know, 15%. Just to pick a number. All right? So what we do now is just the simple math. Okay? Just make this simple so I don't complicate anything. Okay. So if you add those two together, then what that would imply is that your hurdle rate is going to be 7%. okay?
That makes sense.
And then that 7% would be then what you would then pop in over here and to say, how much could we afford to pay for this property? Make sense?
No, and I remember doing this now, but doing the same thing, so thank you.
Okay. Okay. Everybody good with that? Okay. Yeah, we're gonna get into it later. Okay, don't worry about it right now. Okay. All right, now, one of the next things that you need to do, if you took a look at the handout 2, is specifically to talk a little bit about sort of how you construct your income statement and kind of look at some of the key variables there. So, one of the things that you've got to be very familiar with is an income statement. And you need to be pretty much to construct these just on the fly, okay? Really quick, very easily. Now, your text, and I may deviate just a teensy bit. I'm going to look and see just they always use slightly different terms from what I use, and I'll use the terms that I normally use, and then I'll sort of show you what they use. Okay, so the normal income statement, you're going to start out with potential gross income, okay? And then from that, you are going to subtract out vacancies and collection losses. And I'm going to go over this in more detail, so just don't get excited yet. Okay, we're going to add in other income. That's going to give us effective gross income. We're going to subtract out total operating expenses. That's going to give us net operating income. Then we're going to subtract out annual debt service, which is going to give us before tax cash flow. Okay. Now, for those of you that took the real estate finance course, that's pretty much about as far as we went. Okay. In this course, we're going to go a few steps further. We're going to go down and be able to calculate after-tax cash flow. But we're going to get to that later. Okay. So relax on that. Let me explain on each of these. And in your text, in order to be consistent with what they are doing, instead of calling this potential gross income, they're calling it potential rental income. They still have the vacancy and credit losses. They actually insert another step in there, effective rental income. But ultimately, they come down to the net operating income. Okay, so it's not really that much variation, if any. Okay. All right. Now, let's just sort of take each one of these one by one and kind of work through an example. All right. So your potential gross income. The way I like to explain it is this is the maximum amount of revenue that the property could generate if it's 100% occupied based upon the rents that it's charging. So let's just say that we take an apartment complex. It's always kind of an easy one to use, all right? Now, let's say that each unit, to keep things simple, is charging $1,000 a month. All right, that's the rental rate per unit. All right, so per year, we're going to need to multiply that by 12. So $12,000 a year per unit. Okay, how many units do we want to have? Keep it simple, 100 units. Okay, so 100 units, that's going to give us what, 1.2 million? Is that right? Yeah. Make sure I don't screw it up.
2 zeros. That's all you
I should have to add 2 zeros. Yep, that's okay. So that should be our PGI. All right, 1.2 million. Everybody comfortable with that and what that represents? Okay. Now, from that, if this is a brand new property, we've got to kind of go out in the market and sort of make some determinations about what lease-up periods are, what the average, vacancies are for other similar properties, that sort of thing. But let's just say that we go through all that brain damage and we ultimately settle on a nice 10% vacancy and credit loss. Okay, so that means that 10% of the units are ultimately going to be unoccupied or not paying rent for that first year. So 120,000 as our vacancies and collection losses. Now, once again, I just sort of implicitly said what the difference is between the vacancy and the collection loss. A vacancy is simply where the unit is empty, therefore there's no rent coming in, whereas a collection loss is you actually maybe have someone in the unit, but they're not paying rent, okay? They're deadbeat tenants, exactly. All right, now, after that, we add in other income. Now, other income for an apartment complex, this is going to be all those ancillary sort of services, concierge services, could also be parking fees,
Vending machines.
you know, vending machines, anything that is generating other supplementary income in addition to the actual rental income. All right, so in this case, I'm just going to throw out a number, oops, of, let's say, $75,000. Okay? All right. So now we just do the simple math to get our EGI. So 1.2 million minus 120,000 plus 75,000. So $1,155,000 of effective gross income. Now, the way that I like to sort of explain effective gross income is this is the amount of money you really have sitting around in your bank account, okay, in terms of the total amount of income over the course of the year that you've generated, all right? Now, from that, we have to subtract out operating expenses, okay? Now, for an apartment community, you know, operating expenses can be everything from maintenance and repairs to paying for property management to paying for property taxes, not income taxes, but property taxes. You're also going to be paying for insurance, some utilities.
Unit turns.
I'm sorry?
Unit turns.
Yep, anytime that you obviously have a change in units over the course of the year, you're going to pay for whatever you need to do to ultimately get those units ready for occupancy again. So let's just say, for simplicity's sake, you read the number right off my head. Okay, 35%, all right? So all we're going to do is take that 1155 times 0.35, and we're going to end up with 404,250 as our total operating expenses for the property.
And you use 35 just.
I just pulled it out of the air, okay? And now, in this class, I'm allowed to pull everything out of the air. In the market analysis class, which like with Wurtzer, you know, it's going to be a much more, you know, you've got to come up with precisely where you get those numbers from and making sure that you're getting precisely the right niche and all that sort of stuff. I'm concerned with the process.
Ideally, this is done at the end of the year, so you know exactly your number.
Precisely. Okay? But 35 is a good number, usually. All right. So that gets us down to net operating income. All right, so 1155 minus the 404,250. That leaves us with 750, okay, as our NOI. Okay? Everybody good with that? Any questions? Okay? So, NOI, this is the number that most often, whenever you see commercial properties being marketed and being talked about, that's the number that in most instances that they're going to be referring to as kind of the cash flow that the property is throwing off. Because that's the number that you normally are going to be using with your cap rate to determine what the value of the property is. Because you're pretty much saying this is really the income the property is generating on an annual basis. Okay? Is everybody cool with that? All right, so now if we just, once again, kind of for simplicity's sake, we kind of go back to our good old friend Irv to calculate a value for this, and we say that that annual net operating income is 750, and then we use, I don't know, a cap rate of, let's say, 6%. That gives us a value of around $12,512,500. Now, one of the questions that invariably you should ask, and you're probably going to ask, is, well, where do you get your cap rate? Well, Yet again, this is the sort of thing that is risk determinant. That, in other words, depending on the kind of property that we're looking at, that cap rate's going to vary. It's going to vary over time, it's going to vary over property type, it's going to vary over market. So it's the sort of thing that you're ultimately, whenever you're looking at a property, you're going to have to look at what have properties within this market sold for and kind of work backwards. In other words, over the past, let's say, 3 or 4 years, what have the properties within this particular market sold for? Use that, input that here as your value, and then take whatever income that they've generated and divide it by that sale price, and then probably average those to get what that cap rate is going to be for that particular product type within that particular market. Does that make sense?
Is the cap rate similar to interest rates related to risk in the sense that the higher the cap rate, the lower the risk, and vice versa?
No, it's the opposite.
So
The higher the cap rate, the more risk associated with the property. Therefore, the less you should pay for it. Okay? So the whole idea behind cap rates or capitalization rates is that fundamentally, whenever these sorts of things were being sort of thought about and constructed in quote unquote the good old days when everything was very simple and there wasn't a whole lot of additional analysis being done, the idea was that was the rate of return that would be necessary to attract capital to that particular investment, that particular property. It was a risk-based sort of assessment for that particular property type. Now, you see, here's the thing. For every property type, and once again, whether it's by the property type, whether it's by geographic region, whether it's by market segment, all those sorts of things, to a certain extent, at the end of the day, it is still going to be an individual kind of risk perception as to what you may view as an appropriate cap rate for that particular property. He might not, okay? But overall, this market cap rate, which is determined by all the different buyers and sellers that are out there and active, that's going to influence what the underlying cap rate is going to be. Okay?
Dr. Forey, can you repeat what you said about the cap rate originally was the amount, expand on that, required to attract capital to the property?
Yeah, originally we abbreviate it to cap rate. The actual term is capitalization rate. And the idea behind it was this is the rate of return that would be necessary to attract capital, to attract money to this particular type of investment, whatever it is. Okay? Yeah.
Is there a certain rule of thumb with the cap rate between like a new constructed building versus like something that's already been there?
Well, I would say there's a rule of thumb. I would say this, that if you've got a new property that's an untested sort of type of property, the cap rate's going to be higher, okay? Now, if it's a new property where it's just another multifamily project that's virtually identical to all the other multifamily projects that are out there, then you might get a little bit of a lower cap rate than what the existing product is selling for, only because it is brand new, and so therefore you don't maybe have the wear and tear associated with something that maybe is 5 years old. But it's still something of a judgment call. These things are not absolute, okay? There's this mindset that if somebody comes in and they say, okay, well, this property sold at a 5 cap. Well, just because it sold at a 5 cap doesn't mean that there wasn't somebody out there somewhere in the market that might have bought it for a 4.5. Okay? But it's just at that particular moment in time, they didn't. Now, it wasn't because they weren't aware of it. It wasn't because they happened to be tied up in something else. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different reasons, but the point being is, this stuff is not locked into stone. Okay? All right, other questions?
Yep. So the lower the cap rate, the higher the property value.
Correct.
Or the sale price, at least.
Right.
Because it means that it's technically a safer.
Yeah, because what you're doing, the way to look at this, you've got 3 variables here. All right. And what you're saying is, as you lower this cap rate, or this required rate of return, you're willing to pay a higher dollar amount for that same amount of income because you view that income to be more stable, okay, for whatever reasons, okay? That maybe you've got a government tenant, you know, in the property that is potentially with a 30-year lease, so you pretty much know with absolute certainty what they're going to be paying for the next 30 years, and if there's any escalations or whatever, you know precisely and can be very comfortable with that, so you're going to assign a very low cap rate to that. Versus, you've got a property that, like a retail property that maybe is half empty now, and the prospects for its future are even worse. So there's a very good chance you're going to apply a very, very high cap rate to that.
Which means your price, you're just gonna.
It's going to go down the basement. Unless, then you get something that comes along like, I don't know, you know, Amazon or somebody else that says, okay, we're now going to start taking over retail centers as our last mile sort of distribution kind of play, and then start buying up maybe existing retail centers to use as, you know, distribution points or, you know, accelerated in order to deal with, you know, food items or whatever it might be, then, you know, that's a whole nother, you know, thing to deal with later. Okay.
Usually, isn't it like for the cap rate of the commercial property like you're talking about, if it has an income, for example, isn't that how the cap rate is like evaluated anyway? Like if you're renting out a property and you're getting like, you know, you're getting only 7% or 8%, isn't that how the cap rate is calculated anyway? So how would you put a higher cap rate if half of the property is empty?
No, what you're doing is you're saying how stable is that cash flow for that particular property type. And because it's not going to be universal that every single retail property that you're going to apply the same cap rate to. You're going to have to look at that particular property and if its occupancy level and its prospects for the future are more horrible than the market as a whole, you're definitely going to apply a higher cap rate to it.
Which means you're gonna sell it out of the lot price.
If you don't, you're going to be paying a lot more money than you should be paying for those retail properties. And if that's the case, I've got a whole bunch of retail properties I want to sell you. You know.
So let's say that 750 income that you derive. So obviously we use it on the 90% occupancy. Yep. So let's say, for example, that 750 came from that condo down on Biscayne that's like half, or that apartment that's half empty. How would you evaluate? I mean, because it's only 50% vacant, but because the rents are so high, the prospects are iffy, but there's a lot of growth room there. So it's kind of that the rates are too high that people can't afford it. We know all about that, but yet there's so much growth potential in there. So how would you adjust your cap rate to look at that?
All I can say is you would adjust it upward. But how much more you adjust it upward, it's a personal sort of thing. And this is once again where those unique opportunities exist within the market. Whenever things are out of the norm is usually where the opportunities are, because, you know, in chaos there's opportunity.
Right.
Now there's usually going to be a big winner and there's going to be a big loser. Okay. Hopefully you're going to be one of the big winners and not one of the big losers. But, you know, it really gets down to, you know, how are you evaluating, you know, that particular opportunity? Is it truly underpriced, and under what conditions is it underpriced? Now see, I have a very different set of metrics when I'm looking at properties. I'm usually looking for a situation, this is why I've never bought anything in Florida, is because to me, everything here, the value that it's currently valued at is well above replacement cost, okay? In Texas, where I came from and some of the markets that I played in there, I was able to find consistently properties that you could acquire and you could not rebuild that property in its condition for what you're paying for. In other words, what I'm saying is, if I could buy it for $500,000, it would cost me $1 million to replicate it, to rebuild it in its current state.
There's value in that.
So there's value there,
right?
Okay? As long as I can find tenants
right.
that will occupy the property and it will be useful. But if I'm looking at a situation here where the price point, you know, is $1 million, and you know, the reality of it is it's only going to cost me $500,000 to replicate it. That's telling me there's a lot of value there that's tied up in land that may or may not be worth that much. okay?
Makes sense.
Because you can look, I mean, you know, certainly with a residential property, you just hop on Zillow and you look at how much literally a block closer to the beach makes, you know, or on the water versus not on the water. And it's all land value. It's not about the home value, you know, it's about the land, which we're getting into that in some other context. Okay, moving on. Other questions about the numbers here? Okay, now, the next step in this case is to look at what our annual debt service would be for the property. Now, here we're talking about, you know, what sort of a loan would we be able to obtain on the property, and that's going to be determined by, once again, what sort of lenders are out there, what sort of investors are, you know, potentially going to provide us with the financing. And one of the things that you're going to sort of pick up on in here is, you know, what we were talking a little bit about earlier. You may have debt financing, which is the normal sort of go to the bank, get a loan, but you also are going to have equity financing, so that you very well could have equity partners that there's no debt in terms of traditional debt. It's all about different partnerships that you, very wealthy individuals that are just simply looking for a place to park their money, okay? But in this case, we're going to be talking for this, what is, in essence, the annual debt service or the loan payments that we're going to have to make to a lender. All right. Now, normally, a lender is going to set up a handful of ratios that they're going to use whenever making a loan. One of those ratios is a loan-to-value ratio that simply says, okay, based upon the value of the property, we're willing to lend you 70, 80, whatever percent of the value of the property. Well, based on what we calculated here, if we said they're willing to give us a 75% loan-to-value ratio loan, theoretically, that means they're willing to give us a loan for $9,384,375, okay? Loan based on LTV, okay? Does that make sense, conceptually? Now, another metric that a lender may use is something called a debt service coverage ratio, DSCR. Okay? The debt service coverage ratio is equal to the annual net operating income divided by the annual debt service. Okay? Now, the way this works is that the lender, in essence, their number one priority, pretty much their only priority, is very simple. They want to be paid back, okay? And so they don't want you taking on more debt or more loan payments than you can actually afford to pay with the property, all right? So what they're normally going to say is, we're going to want something greater than a 1 as your debt service coverage ratio. If it was 1, then basically what we would be saying is, let's just throw in a number here just for simplicity or explanation. So let's just say that our net operating income were $750, all right? Now, if we had an annual debt service of $750, that means that our debt service coverage ratio would be 1. Does that make sense? Well, but no lender is going to sign off on that, because they're going to say there's no cushion. There's nothing there that if your income all of a sudden goes down, or your expenses go up, or something unforeseen happens, we don't want to be stuck not getting our payment. Does that make sense? So they're normally going to say on a really good property, maybe a 1.1, 1.15, but on a lot of properties it might be a 1.3 or 1.4. So we're going to go with a 1.3. All right. So what that means is if we take that 750 and divide it by 1.3, then we get a maximum annual debt service of $577,500. Okay? So what that means is we put that number here, $577,500, And that's going to be our maximum annual debt service. Now, it's not your loan amount. This is simply what are your principal and your interest payments for a year. Okay, and we're going to come back to the loan amount here in just a second. All right, so let's go ahead and do the simple math to get our before tax cash flow. So that leaves us with about $173,250 as our before tax cash flow. Now, just make sure I'm rounding this all out. So the lender is looking at this, and they're saying, all right, worst case scenario, if all of a sudden your income goes down, your expenses go up, there's still a $173,000 cushion in there so that you're still going to be able to pay me back as the lender. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Now, let's see if we can potentially kind of reconcile this annual debt service number and potentially this maximum loan amount, okay, in terms of, you know, what does that really translate into? Okay, so let's just kind of roll this up a little bit so we've got some room to tinker around. Oops. All right.
So you're trying to, based on your income, you're trying to figure out what's the maximum loan.
Right. Okay, we're going to kind of play around with it from a couple different angles, okay? So first, let's do this. 12 payments per year on the calculator. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that 577,500, divide by 12 to get our monthly debt service. So our monthly mortgage payment maximum would be $48,125. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now, so we're going to put that in as a negative payment amount. Okay. Then what we're going to do, just to play around with this, we're going to put in the $9,384,375 as the actual loan amount or present value. Okay. And I'm going to take a chance here and see if I can make this work real quick to what I want it to be. That's what I'm going to play around with. Let's see where I get here real quick. Yeah, let's do a 30. Okay, so we'll do a 30-year loan. And then let's see what interest rate that gives me. 4.6, okay? Now, that's only one way that we can potentially kind of tinker around with this, all right? So what if, using those two pieces of information, instead, we did a 15-year loan? What would that do to us? Go. Okay, in this case, it's not possible, okay? In other words, with that level of payment, it's not sufficient to service that amount of debt, okay? Which is one of the reasons I kind of set this up this way. So what we're saying is that with a 30-year loan, it is possible, but the interest rate would have to be 4.6. Now, here's another way of sort of looking at this. This is, keep in mind, this dollar amount here, the $93,84,375, that is the maximum loan amount that we could get on the property, okay? This $577,500, that is the maximum annual debt service that we can pay on the property, okay?
On a 1.3.
On 1.3. So, under these circumstances, you know, with this scenario up here, we have already determined from what we've kind of calculated above that the maximum amount based on those criteria that we could pay for the property So this would be the purchase price. Would be the $12,512,500, okay, based upon those criteria. Is everybody cool with that? Now, my point with that is, under those circumstances, under those constraints, would be the best way to sort of say it, that's the most that we could pay for the property. Everybody cool with that? Yes or no? Now, what if we were able to potentially get a lower purchase price? Like, for example, if we were able to buy the property for $10 million, then there's no question that we can make all this work. Okay? But now, if we potentially, if the asking price and the best price that we could get on the property were $15 million, chances are we're not going to be able to make it work. Does that make sense? Okay, is everybody clear with that? Okay, in other words, if this is the maximum purchase price with the constraints that we have, okay, then this is pretty much saying this is the most that we can pay for the property under those circumstances. Okay, so if for example, the property, the best price that we can actually get on it is $15 million, it's not going to work. Okay, under those constraints.
Unless you put down a higher.
Unless you put down a higher down payment, but I'm saying with those constraints.
There's like a feasibility analysis.
I'm sorry?
Feasibility analysis.
Yeah, it is a feasibility analysis, but the point being is you've got constraints within which we've got to work. Okay? Whatever those constraints are. Okay, now. Question? Okay. All right, so let's move forward. All right, so let's see. What are we missing here? Things we need to talk about.
You know, when you say for your NOI, talks about like, things, technically it's not. We got all your balance sheet, cash impacts.
Right.
Starting point.
Okay, excuse me, a couple of other little things to sort of make sure that we talk about. All right, so let's say, just for simplicity, kind of go back to our very basic income statement. I'll make this quick. All right, so let's say that we've got a property and it has potential gross income of $100,000 a year, vacancy and collection losses of $10,000, other income of $5,000, so basically 95 grand of EGI, and then let's say, which will keep it simple, 30 grand of total operating expenses. So basically $65,000, okay? Now, okay, one of the things that we want to be able to do from one year to the next is to be able to forecast what our income and what our expenses are going to be. Now, we're going to be doing some calculations much later on in the semester where we're going to get a lot deeper into this. Right now, we're just kind of focused on some very fundamental sort of basics. So, for example, with a potential gross income, we want to be able to say something like, okay, we're going to have annual rental growth in terms of the rent rates we're going to charge of 3%, okay? So what is that going to mean for these subsequent years? So in other words, we're going to have PGI increasing at 3% per year, okay? Now, all you're going to do to achieve that, and it's a very simple calculation, but a lot of people screw this up, and that is you're going to multiply whatever the first year is times 1, in other words, by itself, and then you're going to tack on the 3%. Okay, so in other words, you're multiplying it by 1.03. Whenever you do that, you're you're going to end up with $103,000 for that second year worth of income. Make sense, everybody? Okay, now, where it's going to potentially confuse you a little bit is to take that, multiply it by 1.03. Now, your initial gut reaction is you're going to say, oh, it's just going to be $106,000. Okay, no, because you're actually having to tack on 3% to the additional $3,000. Okay, so $103,000 times 1.03, you actually get slightly more than $106,000. You're going to get $106,090, and the reason for that extra $90 is that is the 3% of the 3,000. Okay, make sense? Compounded. All right. Now, you may or may not have a change in your vacancy and collection loss, from one year to the next. In other words, it could very well be that the following year, maybe it goes to 11,000. But then maybe the following year, it goes down to 9,000. Okay? So that one we're not necessarily going to, we can apply a growth rate if we chose to, but we could also just simply say we're going to forecast it to be X, Y, or Z based upon changes in market conditions. But we're sort of saying that maybe next year, we still have a limited supply of product, but then after that, based upon building permits that are out there, we see that a lot of new products will be coming online that after the end of the second year, so therefore our third year is going to have lower vacancies, okay, something like that. All right. Other income, once again, we can forecast that to either stay the same or go up. Let's go ahead, stay the same, okay, and then we recalculate our EGI as a result, okay? So 97,000 here. And 102 over there. Okay, everybody good with that? All right. Now our operating expenses. This is yet another thing that, could go up, could go down. 9 times out of 10, it's almost always going to go up because think of the things that are in there. You've got property taxes. You've got insurance. You've got maintenance and repairs. You've got property management fees. You've got all these things that chances are, over time, they're going to incrementally creep up, okay? But, we'll just sort of say, okay, from one year to the next, maybe those are going to go up, so your total operating expenses increase at 2% a year. All right, so same methodology, basically multiply it by 1.02. Same thing here. Okay. We'll do the simple math. Okay. Make sense, everybody? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay. All right. Let's see what else we need to talk about. Okay. One of the concepts that was brought up in the text, and let's go ahead and put it out there, is something called a gross rent multiplier. This is a very, very, very rough measure of trying to kind of compare properties, and very seldom do I even see this used because it's almost so rough, it's almost pointless. But because of what it uses is your potential gross income relative to the actual value of the property. Now, the reason why it does get used in some cases is because sometimes within the market, trying to get all of this other information for every property that's out there is really a challenge, okay? Data constraints are probably one of the biggest things that you face, you know, as an owner, investor, developer, is sometimes trying to get at real, honest, accurate, usable sort of market data that, you know, you can trust, okay? So with the gross rent multiplier, pretty much what you're doing is you're saying, all right, if the property sold for $1,500,000, that's the sale price, and its potential gross income were $100,000, then the gross rent multiplier is basically going to be 15. So what that's basically saying, on a very simple basis, is you're selling, and this is akin to what in finance when they talk about, you know, stocks are selling as a, you know, a multiple, like a price earnings multiple. Well, it's the same general concept here. You're simply saying this property, this investment, is selling at 15 times its gross income. Does that make sense? Okay, so what, now, you're saying, well, how would you use this? Okay, well, if you go out and you collect a bunch of data within the market about what the properties have sold for, and you're able very easily to determine what their rent rates are, and you're saying that the market potential, or the market gross rent multiplier is 10, is the market, and what I mean by the market gross rent multiplier, that you've gone out and you've found a half a dozen or so similar properties, and they are trading at or have sold for a 10 multiple, and yours is at 15, that's not a good thing for you, because it's basically saying you pay too much for your property. Because if everybody out in the market is selling it at 10, then that means that $100,000 of, I'm sorry, the $100,000 of potential gross income times 10 means that you should have only paid $1 million for your property instead of $1.5 million. Okay? Now, I think I know where you're going with this, so just give me a second. You know, what I initially said was, you know, this is an extremely rough measure, okay? And that there are obviously so many other things that you need to consider. You know, beyond the fact that we need to make sure that these are really, truly comparable properties. You know, just simply a bunch of multifamily properties, you know, it may not be comparable because this could be a mix of low-end properties, high-end properties, and everything else in between. It could also be a mix of super underperforming properties in the sense of they're not getting the rent that maybe they should be getting, or they're getting too much rent. You know, so there's a lot of things there. So I guess all I'm really saying with this is be very careful with this gross rent multiplier, because while it's an easy thing to use, in many instances, it's not going to be an accurate reflection of what the real.
Very abstract.
It is, but it's meant to be kind of almost like a sniff test to sort of see whether it's even worth looking at. Okay.
I was just going to go ahead and say that you don't know what your operating plan is.
Right.
There's so many other things
Right.
that can add value that are not just.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. All right. Moving forward, make sure that I've got most of the things that I want to. Okay, good. All right, so at this point, you should be able to do quizzes 1 and 2. All right. Now, let's move on to the material, which is the next material. What we'd like to do is, if at all possible, and we're doing excellent on time. So we're going to now do the taxation material. So theoretically, I should be able to give you all the first 3 quizzes today, and then that way you'll be fully prepared and we'll be back on schedule. Okay? All right. I didn't rush through anything. I really didn't. I mean, a lot of times I talk a lot more. Okay. Let's talk about taxes. And here, we're talking about income taxes. Okay, the way I always like to introduce the tax subject, and it's actually one of my favorite. I wish I were feeling better today because it's one of the ones I really enjoy getting into. So taxes, there are 2 different worlds. There's a tax world and then there's the real world, okay? The tax world is made up of a series of pieces of legislation, statutes, laws that obviously Congress enacts, and obviously they've made some changes, most of which are not going to affect commercial real estate. It may affect residential real estate, but that's a whole other thing we'll potentially get into. But my point in saying what I just said, and I want to make sure that you fully, completely embrace what I just said, there are 2 worlds. There's a tax world and there's a real world. The tax world has a whole set of assumptions behind how properties are valued, how they're taxed, and ultimately how things get treated from a taxation perspective that may have very little whatsoever to do with the real world. Okay? Is everybody clear on that? So if you're going to say, that doesn't make any sense, it's not meant to make any sense. It's meant to be, this is the way the legislation was written, this is how it gets applied, this is the ultimate result. Does that make sense? Okay, so always keep that in mind when we're talking about taxation stuff. Okay, so one of the first things to talk about as it relates to taxes are capital expenditures versus operating expenses. Okay? This is where Michael gets to sit out for a little while. Because
If you're feeling sick, I can help you
okay,
out.
I'm sure you can help me out. Okay, so capital expenditures versus operating expenses. This is one of those things that people inherently like to play all sorts of games with as it relates to how something gets classified for tax purposes, okay? And there's a reason, which we're about to get into. But first of all, let's go and explain what the difference is between these 2. A capital expenditure is supposed to be something that extends the natural, useful life of an asset. For example, a simple one is you're going to put a new roof on a building, all right? So that technically that roof is going to extend the life another 15 years. Okay, or whatever it might be in terms of the lifespan of the roof. You're going to put a brand new air conditioning system into a property, once again, extending kind of the useful life. All right, you're going to go in and you're going to do a major retrofit on the interior of the property. You're going to replace all the carpet, you're going to paint everything, you're going to get new light fixtures, everything's going to be redone. That's going to be a capital expenditure, okay? Is everybody kind of clear on that? Go ahead.
Including the paint?
Everything included. I mean, but it's going to be a package deal. Yeah. See, this is where we're going with this. Okay? Whereas an operating expense, or what I would also call repair and maintenance. Expenses. All right? Repairs and maintenance are things like, okay, we come into a property and we say, okay, we need some touch-up paint. We go along, we touch up the walls, okay? We see there's a stain in the carpet, okay? We have the carpet cleaned. We see maybe the air conditioner is broken, but we're not going to replace it, we're just going to simply replace a part, okay? We see that maybe there's a hole in the roof, we're going to repair the hole, okay? Does everybody follow me on this? Okay, those are very simple extremes, okay? In other words, the way that I would sort of look at it, on a continuum. Over here are CapEx, over here are repairs and maintenance, okay? Does everybody kind of understand the two polar extremes? But obviously, whenever you've got polar extremes, you've got something in the middle, okay? It's that something in the middle that gets all of the attention, in the sense of how far can you go with certain things before a repair and maintenance gets classified as a capital expenditure. Okay, a good example, replacing a roof. Patching a hole, repair and maintenance. Replacing the whole roof, capital expenditure. But what if we replace 25% of the roof? You know, one could argue that's repair and maintenance. What about 49% of the roof? You know, it's getting right there on the edge, but we might be able to claim that as repair and maintenance. Now part of you are saying, who cares? Okay, the reason why you care is because there's very different tax treatment on these two things. Okay, and it will either save you or cost you a ton of money. Okay, these are the nuances of the many nuances that exist out there that can make or break you as a real estate investor. Okay, so this is why we're talking about them. All right, so I have personally witnessed, actually, one of the first times that I was exposed to this, I was living in Austin, Texas, back in the mid-90s, and this property that I was living in, I noticed that they were repairing the roof, and they were replacing about half of the roof. And I was just like, well, this is odd. Why are they just kind of replacing half of the roof? I mean, you know, it looks identical, like the, you know. And so I go to the property manager, and I was just like, so what's the deal? Why are they just replacing half of the roof? For tax purposes. I said, what do you mean? So, well, you know, we can get a full write-off this year as a repair and maintenance expense and immediately write it off on our income taxes as an operating expense if we only replace half of it, and then we wait until next year to basically replace the other half, and we can write the other half off the following year. I thought, that is freaking brilliant. You know, you gotta love that. And so you're saying, well, what is the tax treatment with the capital expenditure? And why does it matter? Well, if you have the intention of owning a property pretty much forever, your goal is to own a property from now until you die and potentially pass it on to your family and that sort of thing, what is going to benefit you the most, tax-wise, is classifying virtually every single possible thing you can as a repair and maintenance expense. Because you immediately get to write off the full and complete dollar amount of what you spent that year as an operating expense. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay? Whereas, if it gets classified as a capital expenditure, what happens is, in most instances, you have to write it off over a number of years. Okay? And specifically, like with a roof, and once again, Michael can jump in here, but I mean, normally, like with a roof, it might be a useful life of 15 years. So that expenditure that you made today, you're going to be able to write off 1/15 of it this year, 1/15 of it the next year for the next 15 years. Where's the fun in that? I mean, in the sense that you've made the expenditure today.
Is that in all the states, or?
Go ahead, jump in.
So a couple things to consider when doing this. So one, if your property is performing super good and you're going to take a big tax hit, then obviously you want to shift as much left as you can, and I'm talking about left there. However, if your margins are small, then obviously you want income, because your income affects your NOI, which affects your cap rate, which affects your value. So it's a strategy. We did roofs at 25% rule. It was 25% or more, we would capitalize it. We argue stuff. I seen an HVAC repair for $75,000 that hit the income statement. But it's not. I mean, in theory, nothing with accounting is black and white. It's all strategy based.
Right.
So you have to take all that into consideration before you make.
And to a certain extent, it does depend on how aggressive your accountant is willing to sort of let you be, and to what extent that they're willing to sort of sign off to a certain extent and say, yeah, that's an appropriate, you know, percentage or measure to be able to use. So, you know, because and the reason for that, and what he was just saying, is that if you push the boundary maybe too hard, the blowback is potentially you get audited, and then you've got to explain yourself and what you did. Now, if you've got a good, logical, rational, reasonable, you know, explanation, and it conforms to whatever, you know, is written in the tax code, and you get somebody that potentially is that meets with you, that agrees with you, then yeah, that works in your favor. Everything's good. But you could also end up with a situation of where you clearly overstepped the boundary, you get audited, and then all of a sudden penalties and other things get imposed. Okay, so it's to a certain point, it's kind of, it's a bit of a gray area. But what I will say, and then we're going to take a couple of questions, is that when you're talking about multi-million, multi-billion-dollar portfolios, think about the implications of something like this, okay? You know, from a tax policy perspective. You know, I mean, look at what has already begun to happen with the tax change in terms of corporate tax rates, you know, here in the U.S. I mean, whether you paid any attention to what Congress did or they didn't do, one of the things they did do was they lowered corporate tax rates. Well, what impact does that have? All of a sudden, you have companies that had parked millions and billions of dollars in overseas banks that they did not want to bring back to the U.S. because they would be taxed at the U.S. tax rates, and so they held them in these foreign banks. Now, all of a sudden, they can bring back that money. Apple is, of course, one of the biggest ones, you know, of all. Bring back, you know, they've got like a $38 billion tax bill they're going to have to, you know, pay, but it's going to be a heck of a lot smaller than it would have been had the tax law stayed the same. Okay.
That's why everyone's accelerating depreciation
Right.
in the fourth quarter.
So everybody's trying to take advantage of these sort of, okay.
So, yeah, what if you drive your NOI down, it should have your value down if you go try to sell it. If you're keeping it forever, it doesn't matter if you're a family business, but then you get on that cusp of the IRS.
Yeah, because,
And that impacts
because,
your investors K1,
Yeah.
and they might not be.
because if you're able to drag down, you know, by paying more and more repair and maintenance, you drag down your NOI, that also is going to impact, you know, as you said, you know, your tax liability, you know, your immediate tax liability from the standpoint that, yeah, you're going to have less and less income that you're going to have to pay in terms of your current, you know, income tax each year. But, you know, if you're going to be selling it at some point in the future, a whole different strategy, you know, in terms of how far in the future it's going to be. Okay, Jarvis, and then
Yeah, so with the CapEx, so like you said, like once you're getting closer to a sale, you want to shift more things towards your capital expenditures, right? Away from repairs and maintenance, because
well, here's the thing. With capital expenditures, one of the things the capital expenditures typically do is they increase your basis in the property. Meaning, it's kind of like saying, all right, I paid $1 million for this property, and I did, let's say, $200,000 worth of capital expenditures. The IRS looks at that as, okay, you have the $1 million you paid for it, you have $200,000 of capital expenditures, so now your basis of what the property is worth is basically $1.2 million. But we also take into consideration depreciation, and which we're going to get into in a few minutes. Okay.
I'm sorry. So what's kind of the timeline on that? So if you were to do that, are you doing
It's the sort of thing you're going to, literally you're going to, each situation is unique. You're going to build a spreadsheet that ultimately is going to sort of show, if I do it this way, what are the implications? If I do it this way, what are the implications? But as a general rule, if you're planning on owning the property pretty much forever and you have no intention whatsoever of ever selling that property, then I would say you classify everything you possibly can as repair and maintenance. Okay? But if you're planning on selling it within a couple of years, yeah, it probably would make sense to classify more of it as CapEx. Because then, once again, we're going to get into this. I'm not trying to gloss over it, but it's going to impact your capital gains. Okay? And the capital gains is how much more did you sell the property for than what you have in the property. And that's going to be, and the capital expenditures are going to impact that. Okay, we're gonna get it, okay, let me get your question, then we can wait.
Once you start the capital expense from a tax return standpoint, do you change your mind? That's it, or not? Let's say-
That would be a good question for him, but my suspicion is no.
Okay.
No,
I'm just curious.
for some reason you have to write it off that, you know, for example, if you do a $20,000 TI, for the IRS, you have to amortize it over 15 years, but for GAAP, you do it over the life of the lease. So you have two different sets of books. Now, if that tenant moves out in 4 years, whatever, you're still depreciating it, and you have to demo that when you do a new one, then you accelerate the depreciation on that, and then you start capitalizing on the new TI work. So, but you have to have a legitimate reason for.
So no.
No, it's a simple answer.
Okay.
Was that English?
Sorry, man, I give the long answers to short questions, so that's why I train with accountants.
Okay.
Sorry.
What's the technical question? So if you replace a roof and you do a CapEx, so you are, what, depreciating? Is that would be the correct
Yeah.
word?
You're gonna be depreciating it over a number of years, depending on what the useful life of it is.
Now, if you, you said that the CapEx also increases your basis, isn't that better to calculate your profits?
It is if you're gonna be selling the property.
If you're selling the property.
Yeah, if you're not selling the property, no.
So even though the CapEx hits your NOI, when you're taking into account taxes, because it raises your basis, it might increase your profit.
Your investors
Your,
like
your,
that.
your profit that is liable to taxes.
Your investors like that better because the taxes are flowing through the company and not through the K-1. So the higher their basis is, the better their K-1 looks. So when they go to pay their capital gains tax, which is higher than the corporate tax, they don't get paid as much.
Okay.
It's a play.
Balance.
Sorry to confuse you with
All right.
accounting.
So
words.
the next topic that is an important one to address, and we kind of skirted around some of the edges of it, is depreciation. Okay? Now, depreciation, this is once again the tax world versus the real world. The idea behind depreciation is that you say a piece of real estate has a useful life of so many years. Okay? And once that so many years is up, then it's basically fully depreciated. Okay? Now, the IRS, a number of years ago, established, actually back in like 1986 and revised in I think 93, that you have two primary depreciation terms for real estate. And specifically for commercial property, this is non-residential, the depreciation term is 39 years. Okay? For residential, and we're talking about multifamily residential or investment property specifically. We're not talking about single-family residential owner-occupied. The depreciation term is 27 and a half years.
Anything with the rental income.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Anything with the rental income.
Anything with a rental income. Okay, this is not your personal residence. All right. Now,
So
what?
does this include single-family rentals?
Yes. So, for example, if you were to buy a whole portfolio of, let's say, 30 single-family rental units that you were not occupying, that were being rented at market rental rates, then yes, you would be able to use the 27 and a half years. But as a general rule, we tend to kind of say that for the most part, we're really talking about multifamily residential as a general rule. Okay.
But a building that is 5 units or more will classify as commercial? It is commercial.
No. I mean, in other words, if you've got like a 25-unit apartment complex, that is still residential.
It's still 27 and a half?
Yes.
Okay.
People live
Okay.
here, it's 27.
Okay, give me a chance to get to work.
Work.
All right. Now,
You might go up there.
They live it's one, they work it's another.
So
if you have a property where you have 80% residential, 20% commercial, you can classify the whole thing as residential and get 27 and a half years of depreciation. Okay, it's a mixed-use property. Okay, and that is a benefit because you actually, as an investor, shorter depreciation terms are better than longer depreciation terms because you're getting more tax benefit each and every year, okay, for those shorter durations, all right? Now, big, big, big concept. Land is not depreciable. Okay? So what that means is that you go out and you buy an apartment complex, you buy an office building, you buy a shopping center, you buy an industrial property. The only value that you get to depreciate is the improvements, okay? What has been built on top of or beneath the land, okay? We'll say beneath and like underground parking garages, okay? The land itself is not depreciable. Now the concept behind that is that land is forever. Land is durable. Land, should not depreciate in value because you can always tear down what's on it, rebuild on top of it. Now we can always think of really weird, quirky circumstances how once you've used the land for something, you probably are not going to be building something on top of it, like toxic waste dump. You're probably not going to build on top of that land, and you can probably make the argument that land has depreciated in value. Cemeteries would probably be another one. Once you've used it for a cemetery, you're probably not going to build on top of it, okay? With poltergeist things, Okay. Now, so as such, one of the things that you've got to consider with this whole business of land is not depreciable is when you go buy a property, as a general rule, you don't necessarily separate out what you're paying for the property as land and what you're paying for the property's building. You can, but you're not inherently required to do so initially. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you go out and you buy a little shopping center or apartment community, you pay $30 million for the building and for the land. How much of that's land? Okay, how are you going to go about determining that? Well, this is where it gets interesting. The IRS actually gives you several different ways to determine what that land value is. Now you're saying, who cares? Well, the reason you care is because chances are you want as much of that property to be depreciable as you can possibly get because you're going to get more tax value for that. Does that make sense? Okay? So the three ways they typically will let you do it is number one, the property tax office. Now, this is one instance of where the local property tax office intersects with kind of the federal sort of income tax thing. And what we're talking about here is like the county's sort of tax assessor's office. Because when you go to their website, whether it's Broward County or Miami, whoever, when you pull up an individual property, one of the things that it will show is it will say land value, and it will say improvements value.
So
all right, hold on. I know where you're going with the question. All right, so you're saying, well, but wait a second, that's not what I paid for the property. What you're actually using here is not the dollar amount. You're using the percentage, okay? So, for example, if the tax office says the land value was $10 million, and they say the improvements value is, let's say, 15 million, that means the total value is 25 million, but you paid 30 million, okay? But, so what you gotta do is you gotta say, okay, the tax office, 10 divided by 25, they're saying that 40% of the value of the property is land, the other 60% is improvements. So what the IRS allows you to do is to say, all right, I paid 30 million, but I can apply the same percentage that the tax office applied of 40%. So 12 million be the land value, and then the remaining 18 million would be the improvements. Okay? Now, questions? Did I answer it or not?
So basically what you were saying before from, a block closer to the water, a block farther away, in that case it's almost probably better to buy the one that's a block away because it's gonna have more improvement value, or
Well, once again, the tax office may not even view it that way. The tax office may be attributing more improvements value than they really should. But the point that I'm trying to make with this is the IRS gives you 3 different ways to establish what the depreciable value is for the property that you are wanting to depreciate, okay? One way is to use the property tax office and to use the percentage of their allocation to come up with a reasonable amount for the land value. Okay, that's way number 1, okay? There's another question in there somewhere, okay? All right. Number 2, an independent appraiser. Okay? So you go out, you find independent real estate appraiser, you pay them a fixed fee to basically value your property and to place a value, an actual dollar value on the land and on the improvements.
So you're gonna get that when you buy the property anyway. The lender.
For 6 months it's still.
In some cases, you may not have access to it because the lender is paying for it. Sometimes they'll release that, sometimes they won't. Okay? Every jurisdiction is a little bit different, but I mean, I've been through a number of transactions where, the lender paid for the appraisal, I never got to see it. Okay. So in this case, you have an independent appraiser go out, do evaluation of what they determine based on land sales and the value in the marketplace. And this one is another approach. The third is the contract price. If you actually go to the trouble of establishing what it is within the contract and simply say, I'm making the value of my land to be $100,000 and then the remaining 29,900,000 basically being the improvements, you might be able to get away with that, okay? But you would probably have to defend it, okay? But the point being is technically it is a legitimate way to be able to establish what that depreciable value is, okay? Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Does one trump the other? Like, is there a higher?
Not necessarily. It's more, I mean, I would argue that the independent appraiser is, and followed by the tax office, followed by the contract price if you had to prioritize them. But I would also sort of say that it's one of those sorts of things that I personally have never seen this challenged, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been challenged. It's just, it's one of those sorts of things. This is not normally where issues arise.
As long as it's not increasing number, we always do 20% price to land.
Yeah, and see, but to see in South Florida, 20% is probably not nearly enough, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, obviously our idea is never to get a full audit either. I mean, we had to go through audit anyway, so.
Right. Okay, so let's just take this value, since it's a nice round number of 18 million. This is our improvements value, meaning that is also our depreciable value. Okay? So this particular property type, what is it? Did we ever say what kind of property it was? Let's say it's commercial. Okay? If it's commercial, you're going to divide that by 39 years. And that is going to give you $461,000 of annual depreciation. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay, now, that means every year after the first year, that's the caveat, every year after the first year, that will be your depreciable amount for the next 38, 39 years, okay? Yes? So am I good with that? So all that means is that for tax purposes, you're going to be able to deduct a depreciation amount off of your income statement of $461,538 for every year after the first year. Okay, for the first year, and this is where a lot of people tend to just want to have their heads explode because of the complexity that sometimes enters into this. In the first year, the IRS makes a determination based on whenever you purchase the property as to when the property goes into service, meaning you only get the portion of the year in terms of the depreciation for how long the property was in service for that year. Okay, now here's what I mean by that. So if you buy a property January the 1st, okay, technically you should get 12 months worth of depreciation during that first year, technically, okay? But the IRS has said, no. We don't want to give you basically that full 12 months, and we don't want to have to be doing a bunch of extra calculations based on the day of the month that you put it into service and this and that and the other thing. So automatically, depending on when you place it into service, the IRS automatically says they're going to use something called the mid-month convention, meaning that if you buy it January the 1st, the automatic assumption from the IRS is it was placed into service on January the 15th. If you place it into service on January the 31st, their assumption is January the 15th. If you place it into service January the 5th, it's still January the 15th. It's always going to be the middle of the month. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
If you just say January 31st, they'll still go back to
Yes.
Yes.
You get a half a month extra.
Okay.
Okay, instead of it doing it daily, they're doing it
Mid-month.
mid-month. Okay? Now, it's interesting to take note of that. And this is where Michael could jump in if he chose to do so.
I'm kind of disagreeing with what you're saying.
In other assets, like cars, computers, that sort of thing, they use typically a mid-year convention, where the assumption is the asset is automatically placed into service pretty much June the 30th, okay? Whether you bought it in January or you bought it in December, you get a half a year of depreciation. But for real estate, since it's a much larger dollar amount, dollar class asset, the assumption is, okay, we're going to make an adjustment for that, and we're going to be a little bit more precise, and we're going to simply say it's placed into service middle of the month. Okay, so what that means, to kind of write this out, in January, if you place it into service anytime during the month of January, you get 11 and a half months of depreciation for that year. February, 10 and a half. March, 9 and a half. April, 8 and a half. May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So we just kind of keep decreasing it. Okay, so in December, regardless of whether you bought it and put it into service December the 1st or December 31st, it's automatically going to get a half a month, or basically December the 15th as the depreciable amount or depreciable term. Okay, now, given that that's the case, whatever month we place in the service, like so right now, what month are we in? We're in January, all right? So we would get 11 and a half months depreciation if we had bought an asset and placed it into service today. So what that would mean is to take that 461,538.46 and multiply it by 11.5 divided by 12, okay, to get that ratio or that percentage to see how much we get to write off in that year. And so you should end up with 442, 307, 69, okay? Now, to put it in your calculator, you know, the math, just let me put it in kind of as we got written here. 461, 538.46 times 11.5, and then divided by 12, you should get the answer. Okay? Am I good with that? Yes or no? All right?
And that's just the amount that can be depreciated, right? That's not what you're actually writing off.
It's the amount that gets depreciated for that first year.
Okay.
But that still goes by like 60% and 40%.
We've already done that calculation.
Oh, because you're using the
You're using improved value.
And we're only using the improved value. But you can see, if we had increased this number, the improved value, to something dramatically higher, we've gotten a heck of a lot more depreciation.
You can play with the numbers as well.
Well, you can play with the numbers is that up front, whenever you buy the property, you have some critical decisions you need to make. Once you've made the determination what it is, you can't change it. Okay, now another piece of information about this, and this is once again, tax world versus real world. The assumption here that the IRS is basically saying is that this property is basically in perfect shape. And it has 39 years of useful life left. Everybody follow me on that? But here's the weird thing. If Michael has bought this property, just bought it, and then 5 years from now, you know, Michael sells it to Carlos. Carlos, whenever he buys it from Michael, gets to start the depreciation all over again. So in other words, you're getting 39 years worth of depreciation, you're getting 39 years of depreciation, you're getting 39 years of depreciation, depending on when the asset, you know, changes hands. In other words, now you're going to have to pay taxes based upon the depreciable value after 5 years, but the idea is the clock starts over from the IRS's perspective. So you're saying, well, doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. The assumption behind it is, well, maybe whenever he sells it to you, it's in great shape, and it still has another 39 years worth of useful life, but the reality is, he could be selling you a dump, you know, and you're still making the assumption that it has 39 years of useful life.
Right, but if he sells it 38 years into the property.
Right, but yeah, but my point is that from if you sell it anywhere before, you know, the depreciation term is up, there's a very good chance it still maybe has or doesn't, you know, in other words, there's no real clear connection, if you will, between the real useful life of the asset and what the tax man says it's worth.
Right.
That's what I'm saying, okay?
Right.
It transfers with 1031 too, which is also, it doesn't make any sense, because it's from one property to a completely different property. Your basis transfers to the next property. So none of it really makes any sense.
And sometimes we're going to talk about a little bit later, yeah, our 1031 exchange is where you can do a tax-deferred exchange of property so that you can avoid having to pay any capital gains on the sale of an asset. You're basically trading one property, trading is the word, from one person to another, and so by doing so, technically you can avoid having to pay the capital gains. All right, which we'll get into later. Okay.
Have you ever seen a scenario where like a company would like just change the shell or the name? Like so after 39 years, let's say if I own this property after 39 years.
It would have to be an arm's length transaction. It's got to be an arm's length transaction. I mean, to keep the IRS from poking a hole in it and saying, okay, that was a total sham
Yeah,
transaction.
they pierce the veil, what is it?
Here's the corporate veil.
Corporate veil.
Okay. Moving forward. Okay.
You go to jail. In America, you go to jail.
Buy it with Bitcoin.
So it's not a nice guy. And you're never wrong.
All right.
It's time.
Okay. Let's say, actually, so we got PGI, minus vacancy and collection losses, plus other income equals expected gross income, minus NOI, I'm sorry, minus total operating expenses gives us NOI, minus before tax cash flow, or sorry, less. Minus annual debt service gives us before tax cash flow. Okay, now we are at a point of where we need to start considering what are the implications of our income tax. Because in essence, we're going to be sort of subtracting from before tax cash flow taxes payable, or income taxes payable, however you want to put it. And that is going to give us after tax cash flow. Okay? That's pretty straightforward. But to calculate the income taxes payable piece is the part where the complexity comes in. Okay? All right? So, to get there, what we in essence end up having to do is we have to do kind of an interesting little subroutine where we take our net operating income and then we've got to subtract out some things, okay? Well, instead of subtracting out our annual debt service, what do we get to subtract out? Interest expense. How is that different from annual debt service? Doesn't include principal. In other words, when you get a loan, your monthly payment, part of it's going to be paying back the loan, or the principal of the loan, and the other part is going to be the interest expense that you're basically paying to the lender for the privilege of borrowing the money. Yes?
I think you pay interest more in the beginning.
You do. But for tax purposes, the only one you get to deduct is the interest expense. You don't get to deduct your full payment. Is everybody clear on that? Yes or no? Okay? So your full payment might be, whatever, $1,000 a month. But the principal portion of that might be $200 a month, meaning you only get to deduct the $800 that's the interest expense. Okay? All right. Now, out of that net operating income, we get to deduct that interest expense. What else do we get to deduct?
Appreciation.
Okay? We get to deduct that depreciation amount that we had calculated previously. Okay? What else do we get to deduct? Amortization of points, or amortization of other, whatever. Okay? We'll talk about that here in a minute. Okay? All right, so anything else that we want to subtract out there? Just making sure we don't want to leave anything on the table here.
That means loan origination.
Yeah, loan origination fees, which we'll talk about here in a second. All right, so we do all of that. That gives us what we're going to call our taxable income. Okay? Then from that, we're going to multiply that by our tax rate, which is usually going to be our marginal tax rate for the purposes here. And that is going to give us our income, taxes, payable. So the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is this whole little subroutine of sorts, NOI minus interest expense minus depreciation minus amortization points to get our taxable income, multiply by our tax rate, to get our income taxes payable, all of that is done so that we now have that number there. Does that make sense?
For the record, there's also like other non-operating expenses.
We can put that in there.
No, I'm just saying, because I don't want people to think that just those items is more.
There could be.
Right. Accounting fees, legal fees not associated with the property.
Okay. Yes. There are potentially other things you can.
I'm too technical.
Okay. So this is, that's good for an accountant. All right. So we have all of this. And our purpose, and it's actually, it's a good little segue to talk about this just for a second. Our idea of what we're doing here is obviously not to turn you into tax accounts. That's not going to happen, okay? Our purpose with this is to make you aware of some of the most important, most salient pieces that potentially are going to make you a lot of money or save you a lot of money and keep you out of trouble. That's the purpose, okay? So, yeah, we're not going to get into quite the nitty-gritty detail that we could get into that could, make this even more complex. The point is, trying to focus on really those salient pieces that are going to be the absolute mission-critical, most important kind of things for us to focus on. Okay, are we comfortable with that? All right, so now, so if we kind of go back for a second. All right, so we had our first year worth of depreciation. We don't have to use that part. Let's not do that. This is going to make it more complicated than let's typically do. Okay. All right, so for this property, let's just assume, for simplicity's sake, that we have net operating income of $100,000. Now, we need to be able to calculate interest expense. So this is what I was really wanting to kind of get into real quick. One of the things that I showed you how to do briefly last week was to use the amortization function on the calculator, okay? Which is basically where you can look up the principal, the interest, and the balance on a loan, all right? So in this particular instance, let's just say we've got 12 payments per year, and let's just say that our loan is $1 million loan with a 5% interest rate.
First of all, what was it, 100,000?
No, the NOI is 100,000, the loan is $1 million. Okay, so $1 million loan at 5% for, let's say, 25 years. And we end up with a monthly payment. See what that is. So the monthly payment's going to be 58, 45, 90. Okay. Now, for the first year of this loan, we want to know what our interest expense is, because we need to fill that in. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use the amortization function. And what we're going to be looking for is period number 1 input through period number 12. In other words, January through December of that first year. Okay, and you remember last week, I said, okay, basically for year 1, it's months or periods 1 through 12. If we want to know the second year, 13 to 24, so forth, so on. Okay, but for this year, 1 to 12, shift amortize, and then we hit equal. And this gives us the principal, which we don't really need. 2619, whatever. Okay. We hit equal again. And we get the interest, which we do need, $49,531.74. So up here, 49,530. Let's say no, 531.74. Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Now, if we had our depreciation amount, whatever that was for this particular property, I'm just going to throw in a number here based upon, let's say, so let's just say, I'm just going to keep it simple, 25 grand. All right? And then amortization of points, okay, I said I was going to mention this real briefly. Whenever you obtain a loan, one of the things that you may pay are loan origination fees to obtain that loan. Also, it can be called discount points, loan points, a lot of different terms that get thrown out there as it relates to this stuff. But the reality is, it's a fee that you pay upfront to obtain a mortgage loan. And those are tax deductible, but they are deductible over the life of the loan. So in this case, we have a 25-year loan. So whatever fees that we may or may not have paid up front on that loan, we would have to spread them out or amortize them over 25 years. Okay? So let's just say, for hypothetical circumstances, that we had $30,000 worth of fees. Divided by 25 years. It'd be $1,200 a year. So in this first year, we would get to deduct $1,200 worth of those fees. So instead of getting to deduct the full amount of the $30,000 whenever we obtain the loan, I mean, we still have to pay the $30,000 whenever we obtain the loan, but we don't get the tax benefit of it until basically we get 1/25 of it each and every year for the next 25 years. Did that answer your question?
If you obtain the loan later, do you do like asset?
Yeah, so you would, so the question is that, you know, if you acquired it like middle of the year, would you potentially need to then adjust that? Then potentially yes. In this case, no, you can just do it, right?
If the amortization period is 25 years, but the loan is, let's say, 10 years, is that, like it's a 10-year fix, let's say with a 25-year amortization, how would you?
You had to ask. For me, I would say, yeah, it's going to be the life of the loan, which is going to be 10 years.
Okay.
Because the amortization, I mean, all they're really saying with the balloon payment is, I mean, technically, here's the way I would look at it, is you pay those fees for a loan that is only going to have a duration for 10 years. You're going to have to go get a new loan after that, so you're only getting the benefit of what those fees were paid for the time period that you're able to have the loan.
Okay, that makes sense.
The 30,000 you just made up, right?
Yeah. So I was just saying basically like 3% of the $1 million.
Okay.
Okay.
The 25,000 also made up?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you just came up with the 25,000?
Yeah, just for simplicity for this problem, since we'd already done the calculation of how to get to the more complicated one, we have to start that all over again. Okay, so 100,000 minus 49,531.74 minus 25,000 minus 1,200. So that leaves us with taxable income of 24,000, 268.26, and then let's say their tax rate is 28%. That means the income taxes payable would be 67.95.11 for that year. Does that make sense? So the point with this, so your taxes payable, your income taxes payable, is totally dependent on all of these different variables sort of adding in, or subtracting out in this case, from your NOI. And while your NOI is your raw income, you're only getting to deduct the interest expense portion. But see, depreciation is an interesting thing. Are you writing a check to anyone for that depreciation amount?
No.
No.
Deferring it, really.
Oh, you're getting a tax benefit because the IRS is basically saying, in this year, the value of your property has gone down from somewhere over $1 million. This is the loan amount. You've obviously got land value and also the full purchase price of the property. But your property has gone down by $25,000 is what the IRS is saying for depreciation purposes. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the reality, and this once again, tax world versus real world. The reality is, it's very possible you could sell this property after 1 year, and the property might sell for something dramatically higher than what you had originally paid for it and whatever the loan amount was. And there, the IRS is saying, oh, we gave you that tax benefit of that depreciation, but now since you're selling the property for more, we're going to recapture that depreciation, okay? And we're going to take it away from you, and we're going to tax it, okay, at a different tax rate called the recaptured depreciation tax rate, okay?
Is that only if you sell it for more, if you sell it for the same or below?
Okay. And see, that is also where it gets a little fuzzy. And the reason why it gets a little fuzzy is it's not just that you sold it for less than what you bought it for. It's a question of, did you sell it for substantially less that takes into full account that depreciation benefit that they gave you.
So if the benefit you got was 100,000, you sold it for 900, then no problem. If you sold it for 950, then you have 50 extra.
Yeah, the whole thing is that like this 25,000 going forward. Yeah, after 4 years, you would have accumulated $100,000 of accumulated depreciation. And so, in the event that you sold the property, for something substantially less, then you're not going to have the tax liability on that recaptured depreciation. But if you did sell it for something more, you would have the tax liability on the recaptured depreciation plus capital gains tax. Does that make sense? Okay? And this is where we're going to get into this, but right now, just kind of understand in general.
How did you calculate the depreciation?
In this particular example, I just pulled it out of the air.
What's the difference currently between the two rates?
Okay. So the rate that we have been using traditionally has been the ordinary income tax rate is 28%. Recaptured depreciation has been at 25%. And then capital gains, we've been using, depending on how long you hold it, but like 15 or 20%. So
it's much higher than that.
Yeah.
So,
as a general rule, capital gains tax rates tend to be less than ordinary income tax rates. But see, this is all where Congress pretty much can easily, well not easily, but they can change it if they choose to do
This
so.
is for LLCs.
Everything changes. I'm
This
sorry?
is for LLCs, this 28%?
28% would be for a normal, yes, an LLC or like a tax pass-through entity. For a corporation, they're going to have a corporate tax rate applied, and then whatever distributions they have to their shareholders, they're gonna have to pay tax on that, unless, of course, they're like a real estate investment trust, then that's a full pass-through entity where the REIT itself is not necessarily gonna pay income tax, but the shareholders of the REIT will. Okay, yep.
In that stack, where will the recaptured depreciation tax will go? Will go.
Only that goes into the sale of the asset, which we're not there yet.
Okay.
Or-
Oh, I see. Okay, got it.
Yep, okay, yep.
In states like, that don't have income tax, like Florida or Texas, we wouldn't be paying taxes on the 65, 95, 67, 95, but in other states we have to pay income.
No, that's the federal tax.
This is federal tax we're talking about here. This is federal income tax, not state income tax.
Is there one that helps the investor, like if you sell at loss?
Yeah, but why would you want to sell anything at a loss?
I know
you know.
wouldn't.
Now, if there can be some motivations of where that you would potentially take a passive loss in the sale of an asset, or a passive loss in the ongoing ownership and management of an asset. But usually those, you're going to be taxed at your ordinary tax rate and not at a lower tax rate that would be you're not going to, it's much more difficult to get a quote-unquote tax shelter than what it used to be. Is the simple way to put that. Okay. Moving forward. All right, let's see if there's what we have here.
Also, capital gains, the longer you hold it, the less they are, right?
I'm sorry?
Capital gains, the longer you hold the property, the less they're going to be.
Yes, as a general rule, but I mean, if you have like a short-term hold, less than a year, you're taxed at one rate. If you basically own it for more than 1 year, it's another rate. If you own it for more than a couple of years, then it's another rate. Okay. All right. I think. All right, so let's do this. We'll take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll do the quiz.
Carlos, you want this?
Free food, free coffee. Yeah, they're gone. Where'd you get this? Where'd you get this?
Great stuff.
From the bird.
Yeah, one of our former students was running.
Chad Max.
Yeah.
He actually did pretty well.
Considering his first time.
No, but you can, like, yeah, I hope so.
Well, my bar was like,
Yeah, you're ready to go. Take it back while we're doing it.
That depends 100.
No, that's the pro. You gotta buy the, either number 2 or, yeah, it's gonna, yeah, you can do this. Yeah, that's why.
No
Availability. I don't think mine's set it as bad as yours yet. I don't have the head cold yet. I know it's coming.
Yeah, those are apps.
yeah, this is slow.
You can use Google, see, like,
I've been using different Samsung. Right now it's good. I'm sure there's other ones in there. I gotta play around. But then you say you can like crop and print out text. Convert text.
yeah, you can use it. Here's the size, it's the same thing.
Class is over at noon.
Oh, okay. Thank you, I like that. Oh, okay.
You start. Yep.
You can start?
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
Are these two quizzes counting as a test instead of three?
No.
Oh, no, I usually skip it.
We'll get to the third one after you finish the first two.
Oh.
What do you say?
Okay. We have one more quiz after this. There are two quizzes in front of you.
Yeah.